On this Shabbat morning, it's our privilege to show a video that we recorded earlier in the week. I had the opportunity to sit down with Jonathan Eig, a member of our community and a celebrated author who is just completing the biography of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And we were joined by Pastor Chris Harris in a conversation about Dr. King and the relevance of Dr. King's message today. I hope you enjoy it.
Shabbat Shalom, everybody. On this Shabbat morning, we're going to be discussing the legacy of Dr. King at a time when this country feels as divided as it was in that terrible year of 1968. I'm honored to welcome people who are no strangers to our community, people who I look to as wonderful friends. Jonathan Eig is a celebrated author whose work has graced some of the most important publications in our country. His biographies have helped us better understand the lives of people like Lou Gehrig, Jackie Robinson, Al Capone, Muhammad Ali. And Jonathan has also put some of these things on television in a recent showing of the life of Muhammad Ali. Jonathan has also just completed the biography of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And we're proud that Jonathan, his wife Jen, and daughters Lily and Lola are members of our community. And we have our senior rabbi of Anshe Emet, Pastor Chris Harris, my brother from another mother, joining us. And Pastor Harris, of course, is no stranger to Anshe Emet. He's a founder of Bright Star Community Outreach, which is dedicated to youth and family anti-violence programs. He has developed the Turn Center, the Urban Resilience Network, based on the Israeli model of Natal and Tel Aviv. But most importantly, Chris has become one of the most important leaders in Chicago and has also really revitalized the effort to build bridges between the Black and Jewish community as well. And it's been a great source of pride to me to have the opportunity to work with Chris over these years. So thank you both. I'm going to start with you, Jonathan. What inspired you to write a book about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.?
Well, we all grow up these days learning about him in school every year. And I had the chance during my work on the Muhammad Ali book to meet some of the people who knew Dr. King. I interviewed Andrew Young, I interviewed Harry Belafonte, and I was sitting in Harry Belafonte's apartment actually, and I asked him, what did you guys do for fun? And he kind of laughed and said, nobody ever asked me that. And it occurred to me that we still had hundreds of people alive who knew Martin Luther King. And his older sister is still alive. That blows people's minds when I say that. His older sister is still with us and is still sharp as a tack. And it occurred to me that one of the things that comes with celebrating him every year and making him a part of our kindergarten curriculum on up is that we've kind of lost sight of him as a human being. And in some ways, we've lost sight of some of the rough edges. We've lost sight of some of his radicalism, but we've turned him into a monument and a holiday and a street name and lost sight of the person. So I really wanted to see if I could write a book. And sort of selfishly, I wanted to go out and interview those hundreds of people who knew Dr. King. And that's been one of the great blessings of my life, is to meet these people and to spend time with them.
Well, I know that Chris and I have been privileged to read parts of the book, and I want to recommend it to anyone who's listening to this broadcast. It is a fabulous book. But I want to turn to Chris, and I want to ask you this. Do you think Dr. King is still relevant today? I know he's an icon and everything that Jonathan said, and I know that Jonathan must think he's relevant because he wrote a book about him, and he's hoping to sell that book. Sure. I want to look to you as a person really on the front lines of this battle and ask you, how relevant is Dr. King today, and should he be relevant?
Well, first of all, Rabbi, thank you for having me. As always, it's always a pleasure to be with you, my brother from another mother, and Jonathan. Tremendous respect for him and excited about this book that he has written. I think, as the seasoned folks in our community have always said, the only way that you can know where you're headed is to take a look at where you came from. And Dr. King is still an icon that is not only relevant, but I believe in this particular season, extremely important to help this generation understand, number one, how to fight, what to fight, and never lose your fight. Those things are vitally important. Here you have a man who, like Gandhi, who used peaceful measures, right? His voice moved the world. His words moved the world then and today. And I think one of the challenging things is there's not enough focus put on who he was. That's why I'm excited about this book, because a lot of people focus on what you do, but not necessarily who you are. And this book allows us to look at the humanity of Dr. King, whether that be the good side or the bad side, depending on how you view it. But it allows this younger generation to know that, as grandmama used to say, God can take a nobody and make a somebody out of them to move everybody.
Well, Chris, you and I are living proof of that.
Amen. Amen to that, for sure. For sure.
So I imagine, Jonathan, that you also came in with your own misconceptions about Dr. King that were corrected along the way. What do you think the biggest misconceptions are about Dr. King? And then, Chris, I'll give you a chance to answer that.
Well, there are so many. First of all, we always think of him as being Dr. King. And before he was Dr. King, he wanted to be a college professor. Before that, he wanted to be a lawyer. It wasn't natural that he was going to become the leader of this movement. It was almost accidental. But every time you get one of these moments of choice, do I take the step forward? Do I decide to lead the Montgomery Improvement Association and be at the tip of the spear at the bus boycott, knowing how dangerous it is? Yes or no, he doesn't have to do it. He steps forward. Every single time there's a chance for him to retreat. He gets job offers early on in his career to go be a professor at a college. No, he is in the fight. And it's not, it's not preordained that he should become the leader. He makes the choices. And I think that's part of the appreciation I have, is realizing just how bold he was and how radical he was. We hear about him getting more radical in the later years, in 66, 67, when he comes to Chicago and discovers, Northern racism. No, he knew all along that the North was as bad, if not worse, than the South. It's just that we didn't hear about it until 66, 67. We didn't hear what he was saying because we were so focused on his attack on Southern segregation. So I guess if I had to pick the one thing that really surprised me the most, it was that courage, that willingness to put it all on the line over and over again.
So, Chris, are there misconceptions in the Black community about Dr. King?
Sure, of course. I think Jonathan touched on it a bit, the fact that a lot of people think that this was what he wanted to do. No, even though later on we found out he was equipped to do it, this is actually what he was called to do. It was actually what he was born to do, but it didn't mean that it was what he wanted to do. And Dr. King saw a problem and wanted to become part of the solution. And I think more people, not just Black people, but more people need to understand, wherever there is a need, God provides vision, but he usually fulfills that vision through an individual who steps up and say, even though, you're calling me to do what I don't want to do, I'm willing to do it because there's a greater need for everybody else. I think the second misconception is they all thought that he was perfect, right? Everybody thought that he was not flawed. And we found out later that he absolutely was. But I'm grateful that they found that out, because now we know, and we are examples of the fact that God still uses flawed people to help people.
Absolutely. But, in the time of Dr. King, it was the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover who were searching for these kinds of foibles in the man. Today, where nothing remains hidden, how do you think he would fare? How do you think he would fare in that way? Do you think he would still be accepted? I get the fact that he's not a saint,
Yeah.
but he is a prophet in many ways, and I just wonder if you think if that would be his downfall.
Well, let's take his clergy collar off for a second. Anytime the Black community produced a great leader, society, particularly the government, white society, sought to assassinate their character. And when they realized they couldn't assassinate his character with his flaws, then they successfully assassinated him. In the Black community, it's very, very unfortunate that there is always an attack on those who are influential. And many of the people who launch those attacks, they are flawed as well, right? They have skeletons in their closet as well. they do some of the same things that Dr. King did, but they use those tools, right, that they had at their hand to make sure that they tried to discredit him. That's what it was, a discrediting mission. And this society today, let me just be honest with you, social media would have drug him through the streets, right? His character assassination would have been much faster and probably much more fierce in the day of social media, because this cancel culture, I believe, would have absolutely touched him in ways that would have potentially made him and rendered him much more ineffective.
That's fascinating. And on the one hand, one certainly understands that and supports that. On the other hand, we would have lost something along the way.
Yeah, I'd like to think that, and I agree with you 100%, Chris, but I'd like to think that maybe today we are better equipped to handle that, to not to judge people entirely by these attacks. I mean, King was I don't see how it could have been any worse, given that he had the entire force of the government coming down on him. He had, all of his rooms, his hotel rooms, his home, his office bugged, all of his friends' offices and phones bugged. He had J. Edgar Hoover out there trying his best to destroy this man, trying to destroy this guy's marriage. The full force of the government is on him. And I just don't know that it could have been any worse. I think maybe today we are more skeptical, and maybe we would have appreciated the fact that some of this was a government plot to destroy the man.
Well, I think the difference is our community didn't know that. Matter of fact,
Right.
Black people didn't find out all of those skeletons in his closet until recent days. And we even today ask the question, why are they releasing it, right? What is the goal? What is the purpose? And where are the documentaries on everybody else's skeletons? Matter of fact, let's just be honest. Our community, since you're asking about our community, we're asking, why is it that it would actually destroy the character of someone like Dr. King, when in fact, we've seen these same kind of skeletons come out and people end up in powerful offices, right? And it be okay. So it's really interesting when you find that a lot of our people in our community did not have a clue about all of those things, because you didn't have access to a phone in your hand. Information was not readily available on your televisions. And so a lot of the things, and a lot of people didn't read the newspaper. So people are still learning today what happened 50 years ago, and are completely blown away by it.
I'm not 100% sure that the Me Too movement hasn't been very effective in the white community. But be that as it may, since we're talking about women, amongst other things, can you talk for a minute, Jonathan, about the role that Coretta Scott King played in his life and in the movement? And Chris, I'd love you to react to that.
Sure.
Yeah, one of my big goals with this book was to give her the credit she deserves. And in so many books of our generation, where you have a chance to correct the mistakes of the past, where we've overlooked the role of women, Coretta was much more than just the housewife who made it possible for King to do all his work. She was the inspiration from a very early point. King was a very popular young single bachelor and dated quite a few women. He chose Coretta, I think, primarily because she was smart and because she was ahead of him in terms of her development as an activist. She had far more experience than he had at that point in their relationships, and he was really impressed and in admiration of that. And throughout their marriage, throughout their careers together, she is not just staying home and raising the kids. She is pushing him all the way, advising him all the way. She comes out against Vietnam before he does. And I think we really need to pay tribute to her and to persevere, having to compromise all the time. I met Juanita Abernathy, and she said that she and Coretta talked all the time about how, they could have been the leaders of this movement if they hadn't grown up at the time they did, if they hadn't grown up in the Baptist church, which was fairly patriarchal at the time. They were both as educated, if not more educated, than their spouses, and as brave, if not more brave, than their spouses. And they had to do all of this and take all those risks without any of the credit for it that their husbands were receiving.
Listen, this amazing Black queen was connected to this amazing Black king, and they did amazing things in the kingdom of God for God's children. And I got to tell you, when you think about it, yes, he dated other women, and had some interaction with other women, but a lot of those women were for the moment. But Coretta was for his mission. She was mission aligned. And the amazing thing about him was he was able to, don't forget he's a preacher. He found him what the Bible, what we tend to call a Proverbs 31 woman, a virtuous woman. And when you look at the virtuous woman, she's not a stay-at-home mom. No, she is a powerful woman that did great things. And the scripture says that the husband speaks well of her, right? And so does the whole community. And so that's why I'm really grateful that you raise up the fact that right, not behind him, but right by his side, he had someone who not only had his back, but was also out in front of him in a lot of these steps, as Jonathan said.
Well, I got to say, Chris, that you and I are both blessed to have women of valor at our sides.
And
That's
amen
for sure.
to that one.
Same
Jonathan,
here.
I loved, and Jen as well. I should have mentioned that as well. But I was thinking about clergy. So in the book, Jonathan, you describe the scene in the Oval Office where it's after the rally on Washington, this remarkable moment, the I Have a Dream speech and all the rest. And President Kennedy welcomes him into the office, kind of shaking his hand and quoting to him, I have a dream, I have a dream. He's very excited about the whole thing. But there are some things that are said in that office that were also chilling to read. And one had to do with the Jewish community. And I wonder if you'd share that story.
Yeah, and I should say one of the joys of working on this book is that the White House recorded a lot of these things, and you can just go online and you can listen to this moment where the Black preachers, the Black speakers from the March on Washington come over to the White House, and the president serves them sandwiches, and there's a recording of it. It's on, anybody can Google it and find it. And a lot of the JFK's phone calls and almost all of LBJ's phone calls are on the internet. Anybody can listen to them, and they're all there. They're fabulous. But in this case, the president is saying to these speakers from the March on Washington, we're going to push hard for legislation. You know, so glad you're doing this. So glad that the march came off peacefully because Kennedy was really worried about riots. But let me ask you folks, you know, why can't you be more like the Jewish community and encourage your children to do better in school? And he, you know, you can hear this silence in the room when he says it, and then he says it a second time. Like why didn't, like he's upset that they didn't pick up on this and respond. You know, why can't you guys pick yourselves up, you know, like these immigrant families are doing? And then finally, Roy Wilkins of the NAACP says, Mr. President, you worry about yourself. We'll take care of our families.
Amen.
Give us the tools we need to overcome the 300 years of injustice, the slavery, the Jim Crow. Give us the tools to have a fighting chance in this country, and we'll take care of our families. And he gives it right back to JFK. But man, it's a really telling statement about, you know, the racism of the day and of today, for that matter.
That's right. That's right. It's kind of reminds me of, forgive me, another president who recently said in recent years, why can't we bring people over from Norway, right? Instead of people from those S-hole countries. You know, the reality is we find leaders that are as clueless today as they were back then, and insensitive, and don't even realize that they're being racist or operating from a racist lens and mindset, and saying things that are quite insensitive to our community. And one of my favorite stories that Dr. King shared is the fact that he got on the plane and another white man says to him, well, why don't you just tell your people to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps? And he responded and said, it is a ruthless and shameful thing for you to ask a man who is bootless to pull himself up by his own bootstraps. The reality is, when people don't look like us and live like us, they typically don't understand us, and it causes them to not even respect us. I think at the end of the day, the reality is what President Kennedy said back then was responded to by a man in that room who was willing to speak truth to power. And that's what we need more now. People who are listening to folks who say clueless things, check them and help them to understand there's a new way for you to think.
Are you sure that if we just don't bar mitzvah every Black child in the country, that the world's going to change? Are you sure about that? I mean, I just want to.
It wouldn't hurt.
Probably won't work.
Could have changed history right there.
Listen, here's the key. If you ask us to bar mitzvah for every black one, then they're probably going to ask you to baptize every Jewish.
Okay, all right. Okay, well, that's a longer conversation. That's for sure.
Exactly.
All right, so one more question. If there was a march on Washington today for jobs and freedom, as there was in August of 1963, do you think that Dr. King would give the same speech? Or would he have a different message for today? Chris, I'm going to ask you to go first on this one. What would his message be? And would it be as sermonic at the end?
Yeah, even though he was a preacher, this generation wants to hear much less preaching, right? You see some of the signs and posters while the marches are happening, these young people are saying, and they're putting it on memes and social media, we are not our grandparents. In other words, we're not going to tolerate a lot of the hosing down and the dogs and the beating and the lynchings that our grandparents tolerated. I think Dr. King today, if he had a speech, it would be far more radical. And like Jonathan shared earlier, a lot of people thought that Dr. King got radical later. He was always radical. People just chose the sound bites that were comfortable for them and to share the I Have a Dream speech. But he had many speeches but that were far more radical that they didn't pay attention to. Dr. King said, let's hit him politically, then let's hit him strategically. But what got him killed is when he started saying, let's hit him economically. That's the thing that made him start to ruffle a lot more feathers and get him assassinated. I think he would have sounded much more like Malcolm X, but even further than that, I think people ought to study Marcus Garvey. I think today he would sound much more like a Marcus Garvey.
What do you think, Jonathan?
Well, I think King gave us a pretty good indication because just 4 or 5 years after that speech, after the I Have a Dream speech, he was saying that dream has turned into a nightmare.
That's right.
He was saying that began to turn into a nightmare when the church in Birmingham was bombed just weeks after, a black man had dared to stand up and say he had a dream. And it continued to turn into a nightmare as cities exploded in riots and the reaction was more bullets, as the reaction was more incarcerations. He said that he already felt like his dream had turned into a nightmare. So that was 4 or 5 years after the speech. What would he be saying 50 years after that speech? I shudder to think about it.
Well, think about it, Jonathan. Today and yesterday, it was pretty amazing. At this day and time, a lot of African-American leaders, while the president and vice president went to speak in Atlanta. And guess what? A lot of them didn't show up because we're tired of speeches. We're tired of wonderful moments. What we need is action. And so we're still talking about voting rights 50 years after Dr. King is gone. I have a feeling that he would absolutely be far more radical and say, hey,
is Chicago any less segregated than it was in 1966? Are the voting rights any more secure than they were in 1966?
That's right.
I think we know the answer.
In some ways, decades later, things are a bit worse for the Black community than they were back then.
It's a honest response to Dr. King's legacy. It's an honest response to the moment in history that we're living in. But as one person in this conversation, I'm grateful, Jonathan, to you for having written this book. I know that it's going to make a difference. I know a lot of people are going to learn a lot. And what I'm hoping is that it will really renew the conversation about Dr. King's legacy and a more honest conversation where we're not looking at one snapshot and the part of the speech that America likes in the I Have a Dream speech, but really looking at him in a total and full way. And Chris, we are so grateful for the work that you do, for the partnership that you've helped create with the Jewish community, and for the manner in which you are leading at a very, very important time. We're lucky to have you in Chicago.
Pleasure,
And to you both, thanks for being with us today on this Shabbat and making Dr. King's legacy much more focused and giving us something to celebrate, but also a lot to think about. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
I want to thank Chris and I want to thank Jonathan for what I thought was a very powerful conversation. And on this day, we think of Dr. King's words about justice, that the arc is long, but we will find our way to justice after all.